Deer meat is some of the best meat you might be missing out on. Yeah, I know, hunting isn't for everyone, but if you ever get the chance to enjoy some deer stew, steak, or jerky, don't pass it up. On the other hand, if you do enjoy hunting, and you're ready to get back out there, be careful. Unknown terrors await you, and you never know when the dark parts of the universe have rested their eyes upon you. Enjoy these allegedly true and scary hunting stories. Go to darkstories.org to send me your hospital stories and creepy stories from Denmark so I can narrate them. Also, check out eeriecast.com to enjoy more scary podcasts. Now, let's begin. The Wrong Place. From Gatherer. Born and raised in the Ozarks, these mountains, these forests, I knew them like the back of my hand. My papa had taken me hunting in these woods since I was a little boy, and I loved every second of it. Sure, sometimes you didn't see no deer at all. You'd spend several hours sitting in one spot waiting for the telltale sound of hooves breaking the silence. Yet, even if that never happened, that time spent in nature, getting some truly fresh air, it never felt wasted. In my younger days, I'd stare up at the canopy, watching the wind blow away the browning leaves. Sunbeams would soon break through and warm up my skin, as the dark morning cold gave way to sunrise. If you've never gone hunting, don't miss out. And if you ain't into killing for food, I understand. Maybe a nice early morning hike will do ya. Whatever you do, always carry a GPS of some kind on ya, and never forget your gun when you enter the wilderness. You see, even when you're as familiar with the woods as I am, terrible, unexplainable things can happen. It was 1998. I was a 32-year-old man who took weekdays off when he could to do some early morning hunting in the fall. It was still dark as I made my way from my pickup and into the mountain trail. Scurrying possums greeted me with caution. A slight breeze waxed and waned, filling me with a slight chill whenever it picked up. I'd always been a deep sleeper and an early riser. There was no fatigue in my legs as I walked through that trail. So I took my time, taking in the sights as I always did, careful to keep an eye out for any fallen branches or rocks along the way. You never knew when a branch had fallen in the night, bringing a small but often painful surprise to a path that you should be familiar with. I walked for half an hour. The bird chirps grew into a ruckus the closer the sun got to the horizon. Small animals scurried through the brush to find their resting places until the next night. But my focus was on one thing: any trace of big bucks in the region. And to be honest, my hopes were getting up. I'd noticed several scrapes and rubs on the trees along the path, and they looked pretty deep and broad, meaning two things. There was at least one trophy buck out here, and they weren't scared of crossing along the trail. My confidence was boosted. The trail meandered, then opened up to a clearing. To my right sat a small pond, surrounded by cattails and tall weeds. Within it, a raucous symphony of toads came to a quiet end as the shadows began to fade. I walked perhaps another football field's length until steadily positioning myself under a tree, careful to stay as quiet as I could. The moment my rear hit the surface of the ground, the strangest thing happened. All the animal sounds around me came to a sudden and unrealistic stop. Usually, as night changes into morning, those night shift animals clock out and the day shift animals clock in. That changeover is usually quite steady. I had never in all my life heard it happen so suddenly before. It was like someone picked up a remote and rapidly clicked the mute button. It was so fast and so odd that I quickly stood back up, as if thinking that might trigger the sounds to come back. Of course, it didn't. When I stood up and listened, it was so immensely silent, my ears rang. One of my eyebrows raised, and I looked around, confused. When I looked up at the canopy, dread welled up in my heart. The branches were perfectly motionless. It was like the wind itself had become extinct in that moment. It's strange and terrifying to be in a place that has brought nothing but peace and happiness to you for years, to have it so suddenly change into something ominous. I sat back down against the tree, praying that this was normal but rare. I must have sat there for an hour, clutching my rifle with a shaky and sweaty grasp. My eyes were wide, and I listened for any noise, ready to turn my attention in its direction if it happened to arrive. It felt as if I was waiting for something horrifying to pop out at me. For the first time in decades, I felt like a kid in his room at night, wanting to scream for mom and dad to chase away the things in the dark, but never finding the courage to speak until morning. My anxiety climbed until I decided to reach in my pocket and grab my phone. I knew talking on the phone would scare away deer, but I was already scared enough myself. I was going to call my papa, who at this hour was probably up with a cup of coffee working on some whittling. Maybe he had experienced this himself before. Maybe he'd have an answer, I thought. But when I pulled out my phone and clicked the button on the side to bring up the unlock screen, the screen wouldn't wake up. It was like the phone was off. I thought maybe I placed it in my pocket in such a way that the lock button was held down, causing the phone to shut off. So I held the button down to turn it back on. But the screen would not change from black. It was like my phone was dead, but that didn't make sense. Every night I'd put it on the charger, and every morning I'd pull it off the charger. And every time I went hunting, as I stepped out of the pickup truck, I made a habit of checking the battery percentage. And I remember clear as day that morning, the percentage read 94. There was no reason it shouldn't be turning on. Over and over again for the next 10 minutes, I kept trying to turn on my phone, but nothing happened. Had I gotten it wet? Did I sit on it the wrong way? Had I damaged my phone and couldn't remember doing it? Once I'd given up on my phone, I stood straight back up, and I decided to head back to the pickup truck. I would regroup there, gather my thoughts, put my phone on the car charger. It sounded like a much better idea than waiting out here in utterly motionless silence. Purple and orange ribbons flowed through the sky, which was mostly clear, with only the occasional small cloud. It should have only taken me a minute or two to reach that clearing with the small pond and the cattails. But as I walked back down the trail, I never saw that clearing. 10 minutes turned into 20 minutes of walking. I should have been beyond the halfway point back to the truck, and yet I never saw that clearing. My walk soon turned into a run, and I began to breathe frantically. What in the world was happening? I had never gotten lost on these trails. Never once had I lost my way in the Ozark Mountains. Suddenly, almost tripping into it, I arrived in the clearing. No movement, no ripples appeared on the pond, and the cattails surrounding it seemed frozen in time. Part of me wanted to walk over and touch one, to make it move, to make sure it wasn't actually frozen there. But my desire to leave overwhelmed me. I continued walking past the small clearing and into the other part of the trail, which in half an hour should take me back to my pickup. And luckily, it seemed everything looked normal on this part of the trail. I began to calm down. The sounds had not returned. Everything was still motionless, but at least the landmarks I was used to seemed to be in their spots. With a sigh of relief, I knew that I was no longer lost. I knew I should have felt that way when I found that pond again, but I didn't. There was something wrong about that place. My watch still worked, thankfully, and I used it to keep track of time. 15 minutes of walking, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I was soon to be coming upon the edge of the dirt road, where I parked my truck. But I then noticed something else that was out of place. Those purples and oranges in the sky, those hues indicating the change between morning and night, they didn't change or shift in any way. The sun should have been up already. It should have been peeking over the horizon, and yet the shadows around me stayed at their density. I began to run again, turning those last few minutes into seconds before the trail broke. I'd made it back to... wait. The clearing. This wasn't the roadside. This was the clearing to the pond. I had just traveled for half an hour downhill, and yet somehow I was back up the mountain at the clearing with that darn pond. No. I remember saying aloud. Where was the road? Where had I been walking for so long now? Was there something wrong with my mind? I didn't have the time to worry or panic as a sound erupted behind me. Some sort of monstrous roar. It sounded as if it had come from a jet engine made of flesh. There was moisture and deepness to it. It was so loud, so close. It vibrated every bone in my body. Instinct took over, and I had no choice but to run, taking the downhill trail again, hoping that things would be different this time. Running full speed, somehow managing not to trip, getting away from that roar. I managed to get to the end of that trail in about 7 minutes. But once again, when it broke, I found myself in the clearing with the pond to my side. I fumbled for my phone, hoping that it would turn on now, but of course it didn't. Exhausted from running, I walked through the clearing, keeping my eyes wide for any sort of movement. The only thing I could think of to do was continue to try the downhill trail until the madness stopped. As I made it to the mouth of that trail, with the pond now behind me, I heard a sound that sent chills throughout my body, a splash in the water from something big. Again, I ran, forcing my body through its exhaustion. I ran for so long I couldn't count how many times I'd passed through that clearing with the pond. Suddenly, at one point, I slid to a stop, like a baseball player, sliding into the home plate. I sat there on the ground and stared in front of me, because in the middle of the trail before me was a massive buck. It was just chewing some leaves, staring at me. I swear this thing had 10 points on it. It was massive, the exact trophy buck I'd been wanting to see out here. It seemed so carefree, not at all intimidated by me. Slowly, I picked myself and my rifle up off the ground. I stood in front of it and looked back at it for a minute. Then the buck just turned and bent down, yanking a broad leaf off of a weed, proceeding to chew on it. Still panting from my run, I carefully walked past it, keeping an eye on it, making sure I didn't startle it. But it didn't seem to care, and once I passed it, it didn't look back at me. A few minutes later, a hopeless me made it to the edge of the trail again. I was looking down at my shoes, tired, sad, confused, but unable to even question the situation anymore. That is, until I heard birds chirping and wind flowing through trees. I looked up as I passed through the opening of the trail, and there rested my truck on the side of the road. I'd made it back. The forest had relinquished me, and I had no idea why, no idea what happened, and to this day I still have no earthly clue as to what happened to me. I've told this story to my grandkids. They seem to love it. They find it creepy and unexplainable, but I think they're the only ones that believe it. I told my wife. She thought it was funny, but never believed it herself. I told my pawpaw when he was still around, and he got a kick out of it. And I do think he believed me. He said he never encountered anything similar, But he did tell me that some very strange things can happen out there when you're alone. So maybe he had his own weird experiences in the woods. I can't be sure. But I'm still a hunter, and my kids will be hunters too if they like it. This experience never changed my love for the woods, but it definitely made me respect it more. Though I don't think any amount of respect would keep this from happening to anyone. To me, I think it was just random, some sort of glitch in the woods. All I can say is, if you find yourself in a similar situation, keep moving, don't give up, and I pray you make it back. The Wheat Fields. From Derrick D. This happened in northern Texas. My dad and I were walking back to the truck after a hunt. We didn't get anything that day. The walk would take us through my grandpa's wheat field along a path. Grandpa owned tons of land, so it would still take us a bit of a walk before we got back to the truck. It must have been around 9 a.m., so the sun was well into the sky, but the sky was gray and fully covered that morning. Before long, it began to rain. Not too hard, thank goodness. I was wearing a few layers of clothes because of the cold that morning, and it would have been exhausting to walk soaked in all of that clothing. I remember walking behind my dad, the two of us not really talking much. I was thinking about the biscuits and gravy we usually had back at home after days we went hunting. Sorry, I was starved. Suddenly, I ran right into him because he had just stopped walking. I looked up at him, and before I could say a word, he shushed me. I looked around, wondering what he was worried about. Then I heard it. Footsteps. It sounded like someone was walking around in the stalks of the wheat fields. The wheat itself was about 5 feet tall, so the two of us could see over it without much trouble. I kept my eyes on the direction I'd heard the footsteps coming from. The sounds would come and go every few seconds. I'm not sure who was out there or why, but it definitely sounded like a person, like a grown man crouching down because they knew they were trespassing. "Hey, come on out of there!" My dad suddenly shouted. It made me jump. Dad's voice was always pretty scary when he was mad. The footsteps suddenly stopped. The trespasser definitely heard my dad. Holy crap, my dad breathed. I didn't see it at first, but it was soon hard to miss. The man in the field began to stand up, and after seeing him, I really don't think it was a normal man. Slowly, this thin figure with an oval-shaped head stood up to a height twice that of my father, who's 5 feet 9 inches tall. Dad raised his gun at it. I heard him release the safety. He was scared. I don't blame him because I was petrified at the time. He didn't fire, though. I think it looked too much like a man, and my dad, like anyone, was hesitant to shoot at another person. The figure crouched back down under the wheat, which was amazing that it could fit its tall form below the wheat stalks. We then heard footsteps, or perhaps crawling, as it sounded like it went in the opposite direction toward the forest we had just come from. I was so relieved. It wasn't coming after us. My dad and I picked up the pace and got back to the truck. Then we called my grandpa to let him know that we'd seen someone in his fields. My grandpa wasn't surprised. We met up with him for breakfast, and he told us that he'd been hearing someone walking around the farmhouse some nights. They seemed to be gone by the time he got outside with a gun, so he figured whoever it was had been hiding in the fields. After finding some bird nests with the heads chewed off the birds and the remains of crushed eggs, my grandpa figured some psycho homeless person was eating whatever critters he could find out in those fields. To this day, my grandpa hears the occasional footsteps outside in the wheat fields. He hasn't yet seen what my dad and I saw, and I'm hoping that terrible tall figure was just a trick of the light. No one can be that tall. The Coyote Pack Attack from Redford, the Snake Doctor. This happened after a late night, scouring an area in Little Rock, Arkansas, just outside the city limits, where industrial mining and processing of materials operations are carried out 24/7. Around there exist local legends of bottomless pits, quicksand, and cottonmouth snake masses, as well as other folklore, which I learned about over the 40-plus years I lived in the area. For my time staying there, I enjoyed hunting and fishing at every available opportunity or chance I had, within reason. Of course, I had my responsibilities, like helping my parents pay the freight, so to speak, at a very early age. But whenever I could get away, I would, and during my free time, I got experience in being a lawnmower, dishwasher, busboy, and all that, earning money in various ways. On one occasion, I was scouting an area of a mountain range, which is on the east side of the highway, which makes up the center line defining the boundary of the county and city limits. With my homework done at the time, as rigorous as it was, I journeyed through the area before dawn, and using a map I rendered hours earlier, I was fairly certain I was in a sweet spot for hunting and fishing. I prepared some lures and camouflaged myself in woodland colors, then doused myself in doe estrus. From that point, I began to make a circle with a scent drag as high as I could reach. Then I went to the center of the circle and made a stand. Preparing takes time, and I'll spare you the details. I headed back to my truck, and I was plumb wore out by then. I grabbed my muzzle loader, and as quietly as possible, I went back to my stand, which was simply the base of a double pine tree that I cleared out of debris the day before. I sat quiet, listening for almost 2 hours in pitch dark. It wasn't until morning that I saw a buck with some beautiful antlers. When I saw the creature, I decided those antlers were a bonus, and I'd be taking that precious venison home and would not be wasting it, like so many sport deer shooting clubs would do. But then I began to hear footsteps, and I thought, whoa, it's a whole herd of them coming my way. But I would soon realize these footsteps were not from deer. A pack of 15 to 20 coyotes were trailing me. I think they were following the scent drags, and even after they saw that it wasn't a deer they were pursuing, they kept coming. I was only able to shoot down one before I had to start swinging my rifle at the rest of them. Let me tell you, these things were ready to take down a man. More and more kept coming, and at a certain point I'd have more luck keeping track of how many pieces of my muzzleloader came off as I swung it, hitting these mongrels. I did everything in my power to push them back and to keep them from surrounding me. There seemed to be no end to them. Minute by minute I grew more and more exhausted, and I knew soon I'd have to give in. But by some miracle, the coyotes gave in first. When the first one began to back away into the woods, more and more of them began to follow suit behind him, until they were gone. I couldn't believe what just happened. I wasn't in a lot of pain yet. I was exhausted, covered with blood and bites and scratches. My hands were torn up from the wild swings I'd been taking, most of which missed the coyotes and would hit pine trees next to me instead. I know it sounds hard and crazy to believe, but as bad as I felt, the last thing I wanted to do was lay down to rest. Instead, I was on my feet, getting a move on, because I did not want to be eaten by desperate coyotes. The one coyote I did manage to shoot at the beginning of this had already taken off, as the bullet had passed right through him. I got the heck out of there, and I swore I would never go back into the woods with just a muzzle-loading rifle. I'll at least have something else as backup. And not too long after this experience, a hunter was gored to death, just an hour or so north of here. Nature is violent and ruthless. Be careful and be safe out there. I still enjoy hunting and fishing. I just have a heightened sense of my surroundings from now on, and I stay more alert, no longer taking naps outside of certain periods. Even the animals that fear you might get desperate enough to attack. Alaska Bigfoot Encounter from Gavinsragingreptiles 1908. I'm a big game hunter. I've been all the way to Africa hunting whatever was in season. But one thing I do know is that what me and my cousin encountered that day in August of 2018 was no grizzly bear. It was Saturday, August 17th, 2018. My cousin and I went out grizzly bear hunting in Alaska. We were there for 4 days before we found grizzly cub tracks, but they were heading out of a zone we both knew no cub or adult bear would ever leave. As we followed these tracks, we began to emerge from the woods into a large open field, with one single river running through it. There are usually bears there drinking or eating. I always carry 3 guns on me, one 30-06 and 2 revolvers. I do this just in case my gun jams. You never want to take chances, especially with grizzlies. But as we were walking through this field, we all of a sudden hear something crashing through the woods at a rapid speed, heading straight in our direction. My first instinct was to fire a shot, but unfortunately, my gun jammed right as this big, hairy, man-looking thing thundered out of the woods, still running in me and my cousin's direction. My cousin was busy trying to pull ammo from his pack, but fearing for my life, I shot my revolver at it. I hit it, but it looked like it got even more angry. So we took off running from this creature. It followed us for what seemed like miles, until we got to the boat and punched the engine to maximum power. We decided to never go back to that place again, so we can stay far away from what we now believe was a Bigfoot. Bear Cubs, from Jared M. It was October 2015. It was rough grouse season here in Maine. I had that Thursday off, so I planned to go into my grandparents' camps to do some bird hunting. I got there a little after 3 p.m., so I knew I didn't have much time to get some hunting in before dark, but I knew I could make it to an old apple orchard about 3/4 of a mile away. I knew there would be some partridge in there getting something to eat before they go roost for the night. I grabbed a handful of 16-gauge shells for my shotgun. I put 1 in the chamber and 2 in the tube, then put the rest of them in my vest pocket. I began my walk towards the orchard. I made it to the orchard, and I began to slowly make my way in, trying to make as little noise as possible, which is difficult because the brush around and in this orchard is thick, so it's hard for anything in or around it to be quiet. I started to break the brush line, keeping my eyes open for any movement. Suddenly, I heard something to my right just take off. I look over and I can see the top of one of the apple trees swaying back and forth. I catch a glimpse of a bear taking off down through the trees. I listen to it crashing through the brush. That bear was only about 40 yards from me when it jumped down out of the tree. So I'm standing there for a moment, just listening to this bear go. After a few seconds, I hear something to my left. It was small and walking towards me, whatever it was, but I couldn't see it yet because of the thick brush. The next thing I know, there's a bear cub only 30 feet in front of me, barking like a dog and walking towards me. I start to backpedal, yelling at it, trying my best to scare it away. The cub keeps going, and I just kept walking backwards, yelling at the cub, knowing its mother was going to be extremely mad if she saw I was near its cub. Finally, the cub stopped. Then it stood up on its hind legs, just looking at me. At this point, there was about 80 feet between us. He then took off towards the direction the other bear went, which I now believe to be his mom. Now, I've come across a lot of bears over the years, and they usually go the other way, but this one kept following me, and I was terrified at the thought of what would happen if its mother came back to see me that close to its baby. A bear attack is not something I want to be a part of.